wanted to draw this to your attention one more time because it doesn't just apply to kids in school, it applies to parishioners during sermons as well. Probably the last time you're going to laugh during this sermon. On occasion, I have begun my sermons with a confession. But most of these confessions have been very lighthearted. In the past year, I have confessed to you that I am a sports fan. That when it comes to camping, I am a wimp. And that I am a t-shirt and CD hoarder. But this morning, I have another confession to make. A serious confession to make, and frankly, a painful confession to make. My confession is this: I am a fake. I am a fraud. Or to put it more precisely, I am not a disciple of Jesus Christ. To be perfectly honest, this is not something that I intentionally chose to hide from you. However, as I read our gospel lesson for this morning, and I listened to how Jesus plainly told us 3 criteria for discipleship, I knew that I was busted. And I knew that I would have to make you aware, because I clearly do not live up to Jesus' lofty standards. My only consolation is that I am not the only one who falls short. In fact, looking at Jesus' radical demands regarding discipleship, I suspect that I am in very good company, as I personally do not know any Christian who completely fulfills all 3. And so this morning, I would like to take a closer look at this lesson, to see what Jesus is trying to say to us, and to see if there is any good news that we can glean through these disturbing words. To set the stage for these difficult demands, Luke informs us that large crowds were traveling with Jesus. Despite some hard sayings that he has shared in the past, the people kept flocking to Jesus. But clearly, Jesus was not overly impressed by the size of the crowds. And in today's lesson, Jesus lets them know that following him will come at a cost. And they will be forced to consider if that cost is too high. No doubt, the first statement that Jesus shared must have driven some of them away. I'm sure that's how I would have responded. In words that seem to contradict his entire message, Jesus says, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple." For Jesus, who preached this message of love, love God with your whole heart, love your neighbor as yourself, and even love your enemy. How can he now tell us that if we want to be his disciples, we have to hate? And especially those who are closest to us. To bring a small measure of relief, I learned that the phrase that Jesus used doesn't mean a deep animosity toward, but instead, it would be more accurately translated as to turn away from or to detach oneself from. To put it into perspective, Jesus is telling us that he is to be priority number one. So much so that any other relationship we have with our spouse, with our children, with our parents, and even with ourselves is to become a very distant second. And while that may make this discipleship demand a little less offensive, it certainly doesn't make it easy. And if I am totally honest with myself, this level of commitment is beyond what I have been able to live thus far. But Jesus isn't done yet. Next, he tells us, "Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple." While these words may not sound too scandalous to us, they would have been completely shocking to Jesus' original audience. Although these words were spoken by Jesus prior to his own crucifixion, the image they conjured up in the crowd would have been quite vivid. Those who carried a cross did so for only one reason. They were going to be crucified. Here, Jesus' point couldn't be any clearer or any more disturbing. You can only be his disciple if you are willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, giving your very life in service to Jesus. I think that this can be understood both literally and figuratively, though neither one is very comforting. Literally, it means that we must be willing to sacrifice our physical lives for Jesus. As we talked about in Sunday school a few weeks ago, while this type of intense persecution is very rare in our own country, it is not at all uncommon in other parts of the world. In fact, according to the Voices of the Martyrs website, at least 25 nations around the globe are considered restricted, meaning that governments are openly hostile toward Christians, that individuals are subject to harassment, imprisonment, and even martyrdom for their Christian beliefs. Figuratively, it means that we must be willing to forego our own plans for the sake of Jesus. When Jesus bids us come, follow him, as he once did Peter and Andrew, James and John, our response is to emulate theirs, to drop everything and heed the call. Whether literally or figuratively, to take up the cross of Jesus Christ is a challenge that far exceeds my own abilities. As someone who prefers to play it safely, as someone who prefers to stay in control, what Jesus requires of us here is more than I am comfortable doing. And just in case these first two demands didn't drive us away, Jesus comes back with us with the final one. So therefore, he says, none of you can become my disciples if you do not give up all of your possessions. Even though I have always considered myself a fairly generous person, the thought of giving up all of my possessions, well, that is a stewardship idea that is beyond my ability to follow. And even as I read various commentaries on this verse, trying to make sense of Jesus' words in truth, trying to make them seem a little less extreme, I received very little consolation. Essentially, Jesus is telling us that his disciples must be willing to leave behind all of their possessions. They must be willing to say goodbye, even to those earthly treasures that they hold most dear. I have to admit, if these were the only words of Jesus that we had, we would have every right to be discouraged. And we would rightly conclude that Jesus had set the bar for discipleship way too high. But thankfully, there are two more things that need to be said. Things that help me at least make some sense out of these difficult words. First, what we cannot do ourselves, Jesus has already done for us. Jesus paid the high cost of discipleship. He left family behind. He left all of his possessions behind. And mostly, he gave his life when he took up the cross, taking it to a hill outside of the walls of the city of Jerusalem, where he paid the ultimate price by sacrificing himself for us. What is impossible for us was possible for him, as he fulfilled God's will for each and every one of us. And second, because Jesus has done this for us, we can live our lives in radical obedience to him. Not to earn our salvation, for Jesus has already accomplished that for us. Not to repay a debt, for we never could. But to live the fullest life that is possible for us to live. One that reminds us that when we have the love of Jesus Christ in our lives, we know that we have already received the most precious gift there is. Indeed, we know that we have everything that we will ever truly need. Amen.
Amen.
Our hymn for today, the hymn of the day, is hymn number 802. I invite you to please rise as you are able.